It's my distinct pleasure to talk to Mannie Murphy today about her debut graphic novel, I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. This was a book that Mannie submitted, I think, about a little over a year ago. Came into the office one day, very unassuming package of 5 zines that Mannie had self-published, all of which comprises most of what is eventually in this book that we're here to talk about. And when I sat down and read this book, really had I wasn't predisposed to know anything about it or really have much of an, I had no predisposed notions going in of what I was going to make of it, but I sat down and just started reading the first issue. And the next thing I knew, I'd read all 5. I thought it was an incredible body of work. And it just so happened that the very next day we were having Short Run, a small press festival here in Seattle. And I happened to be walking past Mannie at her table. And we struck up a conversation and continued to talk from there. And this book just continued to haunt me. And I can't tell you how proud I am to have Fantagraphics publish it. I think it's a really remarkable piece of memoir, of journalism. I'll stop talking and let you talk, Mannie, because what I want to know is, in your own words, what you think this book is. And the reason I ask is because I do think it spans a lot of topics. It spans a lot of styles of writing. It incorporates journalism and memoir and history. And I'm just kind of wondering how the book took shape in your mind, and if it ended up being what you intended it to be when you started it.
Mm-hmm. Well, when I think about what it is as a whole, it's kind of a purging of these different stories that were haunting me, that were swirling around in my brain for a long time. Living in Portland, a lot of those are like local stories that I've wrapped into the book, and it came about from a really like depressed mental health place that I was in about 5 or 6 years, about 6 years ago now, 5 years, 6 years. It took me about 5 years to make the book total, doing about 1 zine, 1 chapter every year for 5 years. And when I started, it was about River Phoenix, and right. I was thinking about him. It was the time of year, it was around Halloween when he died. That time of year is also the time of year when Mulugeta Sarah was murdered in Portland in the 80s. And of course, I bring his story into it as well in the second chapter. But the first chapter was sort of a homage to River Phoenix, and a little bit about his time spent in Portland.
I mean, this is really simplifying things, but there's almost like a Pretty in Pink kind of depiction of the neighborhood that you grew up in and the school that you went to, which a lot of these young men also attended. And then Gus Van Sant's world, which seems like it's almost literally on the other side of the tracks, you know, up in the hills where the beautiful people live. Mm-hmm. And was that always kind of something that loomed, you know, in your childhood? Were you aware of that divide? Or did you only kind of unpack that later?
In Portland, it's literally the hill. They used to call it Mount Zion back in the day. Mm-hmm. That's like in early colonizer times. And that's where wealthy people would live. And mm-hmm. still do for the most part. And
Hmm.
it does loom over Portland, literally, the hill. And MLC, the school that I went to, was at the base of that hill. So it had some crossover with like Gus Van Sant would come there and to find extras for his films. So there was a little bit of crossover, like culturally, with the hill, but it's definitely sort of a symbol of wealth and power in Portland.
Now, the history that you bring to the book, the flood in, I'm blanking on the suburb,
Vanport.
Vanport. I've actually given this book to a couple of good friends in Portland, just because I thought they would really enjoy it. And it seemed like the Vanport story, some of the darker sides of Portland's history with white nationalism, it's something that it seems like most intelligent Portland residents are kind of aware of, and that it percolates under the surface, but it doesn't seem like it's something that necessarily everybody has grown up with, as a part of their history of their region. Were you aware of a lot of that going in, or is that stuff that you really kind of learned as you were researching the story and threading some of these needles? I mean, I should mention that the book spans the course of what, probably 150 years or more.
Yeah.
So how did you kind of come to incorporating those stories in the book? Did you go in expecting to include them, or were they things that you just kind of that were revealed to you as you dug deeper?
I feel like it's impossible to tell a story about Portland without telling the history of white nationalism in the area.
Yeah.
I think it's irresponsible. It's hard to see things like Portlandia
Yeah.
that are very, like, they sugarcoat a lot, and I have a lot of feelings about that show, but I wanted to depict sort of a pre-Portlandia Portland, and how it got to be, where it was. And as far as Vanport and stuff, I grew up mostly in the area called Albina in North and Northeast Portland. And that was the area where all these refugees from Vanport relocated to. So it's kind of hard for me to grow up without hearing things like, kind of ghost stories almost about it. But again, I didn't learn about it in school. It was stuff I had to seek out. There's a lot of people that are interested right now in, like, these sort of these stories of the area of Portland and other places that haven't been told because they're sort of the shame of the area or what have you. But I mean, when things get bound by shame, they get covered up. And my goal with a lot of this book was to uncover those stories and unbind them from the shame, or rather even orient people to the shameful history, and just where we're at in with things right nowadays. It helps to know what came before.
Yeah, especially given the past year, right? I mean, you and I first started talking about publishing this, I'm thinking in November, was it November 2019 or was it 2018? I'm not sure. 19, I guess.
Mhm.
And I don't think either one of us could have predicted, how the past year was going to go. But, having read the book myself probably a half a dozen times over the past year, it really only gains resonance every time I read it, partly because of what has gone on in the last year with the Black Lives Matter movement. The book just feels more timely than I think even you could have possibly expected.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so it's interesting that you said that you had these angsty feelings about Van Sant going in, because to my mind, even though you paint a very complicated picture of Van Sant, it never feels like you have any sort of axe to grind or anything like that. You actually seem like, you're really coming from a place of love almost for River Phoenix, um, and admiration for his work in a way that never paints the impression that you have any agenda with this book. I mean, obviously you have an agenda with this book. It's a very political, um, socio-political story, but it's told with a real nuanced and, just a kind of sincere place where it feels like you're kind of exploring this for your own sake as much as to tell the rest of us about it. So I'm wondering how the book, you know, what was I know the germ of the idea was, exploring River Phoenix, but at what point did it really become this broader history? Did you figure that out like after the first issue, or did you know that going in?
Kind of knew that going in. There's a brief reference to Ken Death, uh, the main, he was the main instigator or behind the murder of Mulgida Sarah. And I mentioned him in the first issue
Mhm.
because what Matt Dillon's character in Drugstore Cowboy was based on, I'm spacing on the name, but it was a man who wrote a book about his life holding up, drugstores for drugs. And Ken Death also did similar stuff. He robbed pharmacies and did a lot of petty crime and drugs, and he looks a lot like Matt Dillon. So I mentioned
Yeah.
in the beginning that, and in a book that is one of my key references in my book, in my bibliography. Um, in that book, it talks, goes in depth about with interviews with Ken Death in his life, and said that he was supposed to show up for audition to be in the movie Drugstore Cowboy as Matt Dillon's part, but he didn't show. So there was a connection there already, and I knew that I wanted to tell a bigger story if I could. At first, it was just get out this stuff about River Phoenix and about my hometown and sort of the way that I was feeling at the time, that where I was sort of homeless at the time, and really relating a lot to the castaways in
Yeah.
Portland, people on the streets and rejected in ways and marginalized. And I wanted to tell something about that. And I wanted to, I realized when I started talking about Ken Death and his connections to Gus Van Sant that I needed to tell the bigger story behind Oregon. And so I
Well,
knew, yeah, I
yeah.
knew early on that I could go there, but I wasn't sure if I could actually pull it off.
Thread it all together. Well, you do an
Yeah,
amazing job. I mean,
thank you.
one of the things that drew me to the book is the fact that I'm a Northwesterner too, even though I'm in Seattle.
Mhm.
And, you know, I think a lot of us who live in Seattle and Portland, certainly the Portlandia audience, you know, we do kind of, I think, idealize this region as kind of a liberal bastion, you know, a consistently blue state and region. Um,
Mhm.
but as you make abundantly clear in the book, that those deep liberal waters pretty much extend to the the metropolitan city borders, and once you extend past the borders, it gets pretty crazy pretty quick. And then in your book, I think you even take it a step further in showing this, how literally the city of Portland was built on the backs of white nationalists in a way that I think will be shocking to people, but I think it's a really important story to be told. Um, one thing I wanted to ask you about, I got the book right here. It's a beautiful object. I wanted to ask you about the formal kind of approach to the book. You tell the story as a kind of illustrated diary. Was
Mhm.
that something that you'd settled on pretty early on, or did you ever consider doing it as a more conventional graphic novel?
Mm,
How did you kind of settle upon that approach to tell it? Because it works really well because it gives it a much more kind of, I think, intimate, personal, you know, relationship with the story, and that it reads like a diary, like
thanks.
something that you're kind of, you know, unpacking in real time, even though I know you're
Yeah, yeah.
not.
Well, I had found a bunch of that old story paper, it's called, the
Hmm.
with the lines and space up at the top for a picture. And I found it at Scrap, which is a place, I can't remember what it stands for, but it's cast off stuff in Portland where, you know, it's like all art supplies and things. And they have a lot of paper.
A suitable acronym for the, yeah,
What's that?
a
Suitable.
suitable acronym for the
Yeah,
story.
yeah. And
Mhm.
I got some there, and I was playing around with ink and newsprint. So it's basically newsprint. And I wanted to draw pictures of River Phoenix, so I was drawing him. And I realized I wanted to do a whole story, and I started with my paintbrush. So the first chapter is lettered in brush with a paintbrush, and that's how I originally
Right.
did it on the page. And I was kind of setting up a technical challenge for myself by working without pencils. So I pretty much
Oh, I didn't
found,
realize that.
yeah, yeah. So my my pencil drawings are look one way, and my ink drawings look another way. And I liked how the ink drawings were looking, and I wanted them to just to give it that, it kind of gave it a sort of expressionist quality. And I
Hmm.
worked a lot mostly from visual reference. So I try to
Hmm.
credit everybody in my bibliography, but there's 200 and some pages, and uh, can't haven't, yeah, didn't cover quite
Yeah.
every single one, but yeah.
Yeah, the blue and the blue and the white on the paper, the off-white, is really lovely in a way that frankly your, you know, your self-published zines didn't do it justice. You know, on a Xerox machine, they just kind of
Mm-hmm.
muddied out. And it was a
Mm-hmm.
real revelation. I mean, when I saw your originals, they just have a wonderfully kind of impressionistic quality to them that that I think really adds to the read. Um, I I just can't speak highly enough about the book. Like I said, I've probably read it 6 times at least, um, over the course of the past year. I can't wait for it to get out there and for people to read it, because I think there's a lot of people between your age and my age, I think we're, you know, somewhere between a half decade to a decade apart, who grew up with those films and the films of Gus Van Sant, and that they were a real kind of formative influence on our you know, young lives.
Mm-hmm.
Despite the fact that they are complicated films and they are challenging films, and there is stuff in them that I think is worthy of pushing back on in ways that I didn't quite understand when I was younger. I was enjoying them on a more visceral level.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just impressed with how much you've both like pulled the curtain back on this material, but also really added to my understanding of it, and in some ways appreciation of it.
Good.
Even though, yeah, I mean, I do. My Own Private Idaho and Drugstore Cowboy in particular were two, you know, really important films when I was a young man.
Mm-hmm.
And I watched them both several times, and I just feel like reading your book, I'm seeing them with new eyes in ways that's really, really cool. Even though some of the stuff that, you know, I'm learning is not so cool. It just paints a fuller picture in a way that's, I think, really revealing and really amazing.
That's good. That's good. I have a nuanced experience of his work, so I wanted to convey that, you know, to people that that I do have a great appreciation for it as well. And they were monumental films for me. I saw Drugstore Cowboy later after it came out, but it was filmed partially directly across the street from my school, so there was a lot of buzz about it when it was happening. So I knew about that, and then when My Own Private Idaho came out, we all saw it because we loved River Phoenix and Keanu Reeves, and it was filmed in Portland, and you know, it had all this Portland stuff in it, and that was really monumental film for me, like as a kid, to see that as a young person.
What was, without, you know, this has like spoiler potential that I don't want to get into, but like, was there any one thing in the course of your research for the book that was a real aha moment, or that really just kind of maybe threaded a needle for you in terms of what you wanted to tell with the story but didn't quite know how to get there, if that makes sense?
Mm-hmm. There was a couple. There was, I had, I think my mom had mentioned this book on groupthink that she had discovered while she was in school. And I found it and I read it. And then I read information about, like, an analysis about the book and stuff. And I realized that that was a key part in a lot of the conflicts and secrets that I was exposing and bringing up. And there was also another, earlier on, there was a key realization when I found footage of Ken Death on the Geraldo show.
Right.
And I had been using that particular Geraldo show because there was white nationalists on it, and Tom Metzger's son, was featured on stage, and I wanted to get some stills from it, and that show up in the second chapter. And then I realized that I had a bigger thing on my hands, because I spotted Ken Death in the audience, and they wind up interviewing him, and it's also the episode where there's a riot where the skinheads break Geraldo's nose.
Yeah, very, very famous episode. I remembered it very well when when you discuss it in the book. Now, what do you mean by groupthink as far as how that influenced, people's perceptions or understanding of some of these stories?
It's like a small group phenomenon. So it was a small group that committed the murder of Mulugeta Seraw. It was a small group who sort of clustered around the filming of My Own Private Idaho, and like proliferation of drug use around that. And so I started, and then just different subcultures, and such as the far right, these groups that get a mentality of sort of, they tend to worship a leader in groupthink, and it's what happens when small groups go bad, kind of.
Yeah. I recently was reading about a study. It's apparently a fairly famous scientific study that I think speaks to some of that, where if you put a group of people in a room and you show them like, two things like this pencil and this French curve thing, and you say, which one is longer? And you have one person who's like the innocent person in the study and everybody else is a plant. And you get 5 people to say that, the pencil's longer, that something like, 40 to 60% of the people who are the non-plant in the study will go along with it. And even though they intellectually, rationally, they know, the pencil is shorter, but they will say the pencil is longer just because they've somehow convinced themselves that they're in the wrong because everybody else thinks something else.
Everybody else is going that way. Yeah,
right.
That's really a great example of that.
Well, I think that we're probably already at about the end of our time. Is there anything that I didn't cover that you would like to mention about the book? And if not, that's fine.
I can think of.
The book will be coming out in March. It's called I Never Promised You a Rose Garden by Mannie Murphy, debut graphic novel. It's absolutely wonderful. And I hope you all check it out. Thanks a lot, Mannie.
Thanks.
It's good talking to you.
You too.